This is the first of two podcasts introducing the Petrine epistles. So, first of all, just a brief description of First Peter. First Peter seems to be addressed to believers who are living in areas of which today is known as Turkey, or back then as Asia Minor. Second Peter is addressed to those who have received the apostles' faith. These letters are oftentimes thought of as synonymous. And if these are synonymous, then why would Peter be the one? Certainly, of course, Peter was an important figure in the early church. This is indicated by the Gospels that indicate Peter is someone who had revealed to him the identity of Jesus Messiah. Peter is also oftentimes associated in a couple of the Gospels as someone who went to the tomb or who saw the risen Jesus. In the book of Acts, he plays a very important role in receiving a major speech on the day of Pentecost after Jesus' resurrection. So he seems to be there at the forefront of the foundation of the early church. Paul, in his writing to Galatians, also notes Peter's importance. So because of how important Peter was in the beginnings of the church and as one of the apostles, we can certainly see why Peter would be someone that a person might use, whose name they might use. So he has a legacy in Paul's writings and in the Gospels and in Acts, and so this makes him a prime candidate to be used for a work of pseudonymity. However, that doesn't prove that it is a work of pseudonymity. So there are other factors which we'll need to look at. So why is it sometimes questioned whether or not Peter wrote this? Well, the level of Greek and the rhetorical style that is used seems more sophisticated of a formally trained author. And the situation of suffering envisioned is more reflective of persecution that dates after AD 70. Now, according to church tradition, which also recognizes the importance of Peter, some church tradition sees Peter as having died a martyr's death in the period of the 60s during the time of Nero persecution. So if that is the case, and if the suffering that some people think is indicated in the letter is more reflective of a period after AD 70, then it becomes less likely that Peter is the actual author of the letter. First Peter appears to be dependent upon later Pauline epistles. He certainly makes note of Paul's letter writing and that they are difficult. And so for that reason, people think it must be after Paul has written his letters. Again, dating Paul's letters to the end of the 40s and through the 50s, even with the possibilities of some in the 60s, then how does this letter, how can this letter be dated if it already knows the existence of these letters and these letters have circulated and been in use by several churches? The places where believers are to be, it seems to be too remote to have been evangelized before AD 70, or at least this is one of the arguments that is sometimes used to question Petrine authorship. However, these are not arguments that cannot at least be addressed. There are not rebuttals to them. So once again, they are not conclusive on the authorship or the lack of Petrine authorship. Of course, at the end of 1 Peter 5:12, there is reference to Silvanus, who helped him to write the letter. So maybe this Silvanus is someone who's kind of like an amanuensis, something like a secretary, whose level of Greek is better than Peter's might have been, since Peter, as we know from the Gospels, is a fisherman. We might not expect a great deal of training or skill in writing in Greek. So maybe Peter can talk, and Silvanus, who may have better writing skills, is the one who actually composed the letter. So there certainly is questions about who the authorship is, but it is not conclusive that Peter could not have been the writer. So why do some accept Petrine? Well, the level of Greek and rhetorical can be accounted for by the use of this eunesis, also recognizing how much Greek Galilean and Agrarian Jews actually had. Maybe it could even suggest that Peter is a bilingual author. There is nothing about the ecclesiastical history. We have a mention of an episkopos in chapter 5, verse 2. Presumes in it that suggests a later date. So the church structure, ecclesiastical, referring to church, the hierarchy of the church does not look too sophisticated. So if it was written later, and since there was more sophistication in the church structure at a later time, maybe the letter does suggest that it was written at an earlier period. And there is nothing about the sufferings of these believers that would connect it to any particular imperial persecution, whether that is the brief persecution of Nero, of Christians, after the burning of the fires in Rome, or of Domitian, which was a larger scale, or even Trajan, which was probably the more severe persecution. So as far as the authorship and the date of 1 Peter, 1 Peter's use of the Pauline expression in Christ may be due to Christian tradition rather than any kind of knowledge of Pauline epistles. Or it could be that Paul's co-worker Silas, who's mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 1:1, is Peter's amanuensis Silvanus, because the Latin form of Silas. So we might have the same individual behind each letter. So maybe the in Christ language, which we know of as associated with Paul's writings, maybe that is brought in because we have the same secretary. The same secretary is the one who uses that expression, having been influenced by Paul. It is at least possible that the remote places mentioned in 1 Peter 1:1 were populated by those Roman Christians who were expelled by Claudius, to whom Peter in Rome is now writing. And this is according to Karen Jobes in her work on the letters to the church. So that's an interesting possibility that with Claudius expelling certain believers because of some kind of disruption, then it may be that these are the people who are being referred to in 1 Peter 1:1 as foreigners and exiles. So these are people who have been exiled, as it were, from Rome, and they had to go and live in other places. So they most likely went to some of these places mentioned in 1 Peter because these places are more associated with Roman culture. And so these Roman Jewish Christians or even Gentile Christians may have felt it's best to go to places that had a feeling, a setting that was something similar to what they had experienced back in Rome, at least until the edict would be lifted later and those people could return. Karen Job does identify a twofold purpose in 1 Peter 5:12. What she identifies is that the truth about God's grace that is offered in and through the person of Jesus Christ. This is what 1 Peter is trying to present. And also the kind of a moral exhortation to stand firm in that truth and its implication for Christian identity. So we'll take a look more at some of the other aspects of a general introduction of the themes in 1 Peter in our second podcast. This gives us a short idea about this letter and its recipients and its purpose.